Hello and welcome to the dungeon. I'm your host Rob. In today's video we're going to be talking about part 2 of the Whitespire campaign I ran, and this one is basically tier 2 of play. I mean, the levels might not quite add up or match up perfectly, but I think this stretch of adventures took them from like level 5 till 10 or 11 or so by the time we were done. And one thing I wanted to do here was to give them a chance to work on a lot of their backstory stuff. In case you remember from episode 0, I'd given each player a list of like 2 rumors they'd heard, 2 secrets that they knew, 2 people they could know and trust, and then 2 people they'd met. And all of these things were just ways of like planting story hooks and things like that in with each character. So they'd have something to investigate as they, began play essentially, right? But up till now, they'd mostly been dealing with the siege and trying to stop the enemy army. And as I mentioned in the last video, my idea wasn't so much that the players would be fighting enemies on the castle or on the city walls or anything. Although I think that kind of stuff is great, but I've also done that with these guys before, and I didn't want to just rehash that type of thing over again, right? So my idea was that the invading army was very large, but they weren't large enough to be able to like overcome the city by force of arms, which is why they had to do things like try to tunnel under the city and take it from, inside, right? Why they used the magical disease that the players had to fight at the docks in order to try to like weaken the city's defenses and stuff. A lot of those type of things were all happening. And then ultimately, of course, they try to use a doppelganger to assassinate the king and take his place, right? And then, try to run things themselves, essentially. But as the players managed to overcome each of these threats, and basically the sieging army has no choice but to just retreat because all of their other plans have kind of fallen apart, and they know they can't win by just like straight up brute force. So up till now though, the players have never even left Whitespire. They've never had a chance to go because the city was under a blockade and was under siege. So I wanted to give them a chance to start interacting with some of the NPCs they'd met, to start following some of their own individual plot threads, as well as to kind of start going a bit abroad and exploring the larger world. And I really wanted Whitespire to be like this central base where they would always be able to come back to, but to also establish this idea that, they could also leave and go do other things as well. And I remember I watched a video from Matt Colville on his channel, which is an excellent channel, and I'll try to remember to put a link to hit this specific video in my description. But he did a video on sandboxing, and one of the things he liked to talk about was that a lot of times, to save himself on a lot of prep work, because sandboxing campaigns can be hard to run sometimes, what he liked to do was plant a bunch of story hooks and seed ideas, and each one would be connected to like different pre-made adventures. So if the players decide to investigate A, that leads to like this adventure, B leads to this adventure, C leads to this adventure, right? And then the players still feel like they're the ones in charge. They're getting to choose what they want to do and what they don't, which story threads are interesting to them and whatnot, right? But then it also saves him time because he could run these pre-prepared, like store-bought adventures or ones that he'd run before that he was very familiar with and that he knew would be like a good fit for the players, those kind of things, right? And I've done this kind of stuff myself in the past, but I'd never really taken it to the kind of art form that he talked about. So I really wanted to try that idea in this campaign. So the next set of adventures were mostly things that I just took from other people and maybe made some adjustments and changes. We'll talk about those as we get there. But I wanted to give the players a chance to like investigate and explore their own stuff and, just have that lead to a bunch of adventures, right? So one of the things that happened early on inside the city, they met this couple. The man was named Luther and the woman was named Abigail. And Luther was a member of the Inquisition. And if you remember me saying, the Inquisition is this group of like paladins and clerics for the most part. Although Luther himself was actually a fighter. And they serve like this kind of secret, but not secret, open secret, I guess we'll call it, like cabal, who basically their job is to like hunt down heretics and like demon cults and anybody who doesn't follow the Nine, essentially, right? So even though a lot of these gods in the Nine are enemies themselves, the bigger enemy, of course, is always gods outside of the pantheon, because that could lead people to, false religions, and that can't be allowed. So Luther is a member of the Inquisition, and one of the things that made him kind of interesting, I guess, was that he actually had like this dwarven pistol. And I knew I wanted to have firearms in my world, but I didn't want them to be a big part of the world. And I didn't want them to be like readily available and just, you could walk into a store and buy them. But I didn't want them to be like so obscure that nobody ever knew they existed either. And so I came up with this idea of these like dwarves that lived like way up in the far north, like way further than the ones that helped build Whitespire. And these dwarves were kind of like Vikings essentially. They actually sail around in ships. They mostly live outdoors, although they do have like some underground stuff in the mountains as well, right? Some cities and stuff. But for the most part, they live above ground and they just, hunt seals and stuff like that, right? Fish, whatever, right? But they're also at war with this army of giants. And so my idea was the dwarves had pistols and like rifles and stuff. And that's kind of the equalizer that allowed them to sort of maintain this balance of power with the giants and not just get exterminated. So Luther had saved a bunch of these dwarves, and one of them had taught him the art of using the gun and maintaining it and like making his own like powder for it, as well as like creation of more like musket balls to use for the gun, right? And so this was kind of the first introduction the players had to that. And I'd kind of mentioned before that firearms did exist, but this is the first time you get to see it, right? And then the woman Abigail, she was a paladin from a different city called Bard's Gate, and I got the name Bard's Gate from a different, I think it was some third-party group. I can't remember which one now. Sorry, but they had a large book, and it was just a city book source on a city called Bard's Gate, and I really liked the idea, like the name of it. But the city book itself was like really big, and I was kind of busy doing my own thing. And this is something I do a lot, where maybe I hear a name and it kind of triggers an idea in my head, and then I like what my idea was better than their idea, so I just go with my idea. And that's kind of what happened here. So I just like the idea of this city that was founded by all these bards and all the different bardic colleges, and that they would like basically run the city, and it was this center for like arts and music and stuff like that, right? But it's also a place of like great like espionage and intrigue and like Machiavellian backbiting and stuff like that, right? So I thought Bard's Gate would be an interesting place for a future campaign maybe, and I kind of wanted to introduce the idea of it here, right? So, another thing that I thought was interesting about Bard's Gate, complete aside, but I'd watched Starship Troopers recently, and so I decided when I made Bard's Gate, because it was going to be like this independent city-state, that they would have this whole, service guarantees citizenship idea, and all the bard colleges, all the leaders would all be like elected by citizens of the city, but you couldn't become a citizen unless you were actually like a member of the college or served in the military for 4 years or whatever it was, right? But then lots of people in the city never were citizens at all, so it wasn't really like the second-class status. Really, the only difference was you just couldn't vote. But a lot of like very wealthy, very successful people in the city weren't even citizens. Anyways, that's just another aside. It was, just a small point of interest. I watched Starship Troopers and I'm like, oh, I should put that in my world somewhere. Anyways, so they end up helping Luther and Abigail. Luther's investigating some sort of cult, and Abigail's trying to find her brother, who turns out has joined the cult. And so the players are able to help them. They investigate all this stuff and are able to put an end to that. That was kind of them meeting them. It wasn't really a big deal, but I just thought I'd introduce it, mostly because it introduced some different ideas and kind of the larger world around it, right? The players also did an adventure called The Witch's Song, which was actually another Warhammer Fantasy roleplay adventure. And this one led to them meeting a bunch more members of the Inquisition, but they were a lot less friendly than Luther was. And the idea was the players are supposed to like help the villagers out, more or less. But my players hated the villagers because the villagers were a bunch of like really weird and eccentric NPCs, which I personally loved. But my players, not so much. So they kind of were like, leave them to their own devices and see what happens. So the players kind of like left, and we can only presume the village was probably put to the torch by members of the Inquisition. So very heroic, guys. But anyways, I remember they had dinner at the mayor's house. It was like one of the events that happened. And the mayor has like 100 pigeons that live in the house, and they're just like flying everywhere and like pooping on everything. There's like, and the house is just a disaster. And the servants are basically just spend all their time cleaning up after the pigeons, while also being forced to basically pretend the pigeons don't even exist. And the players were just like revolted by this guy, and just the entire situation, right? So that ended up being a fun adventure. But like I said, eventually the players do manage to save the town, but kind of decide when the Inquisition finds out that the villagers are all have some like weird ritual worshipping habits that aren't really approved. The players are just like, ooh, sucks to be them. Well, we're out of here. And like I said, we can only assume at this point the Inquisition probably put the place to the torch. So that was an interesting adventure that didn't quite go the way I planned, but that's okay. Another one I used was against the cult of the Reptile God, and this is one that Matt Colville had talked about, and I'd never run it, so I was like, yeah, that actually sounds pretty cool. And the things I really liked about it were a lot of the theme and atmosphere. So spoilers for all these adventures from here on out. Sorry, spoilers. Okay, you've been warned. So there's actually this cult led by this Naga, and they are kidnapping villagers and basically like brainwashing them and dominating them and stuff like that. And then those villagers will then go find other villagers, bring them to the cult, and eventually they're just like taking over the entire town, one person at a time, right? And the thing has this really cool like invasion of the body snatchers type feel, where so like the one player Cole, the traveling merchant bard guy, he gets a letter from some people that he knew that he was friends with, and they tell him that something weird's going on in the town. A lot of people are disappearing, and they come back like a few days or even weeks later, but they're just not themselves anymore. And so the players go there to help them out, and they start investigating stuff. And I really like this whole like creepy vibe where it has like this almost Children of the Corn type atmosphere in some ways. And again, like I really like mixing horror elements into my D&D games a lot of times. I don't want it all the time, but I find that when you do add it in, it really makes for some interesting game sessions. And I think if it's there every game, it might start to get old, but just sprinkled in different adventures really kind of sets a certain mood or atmosphere. So that was a fun adventure. There were some problems with it as written though, because it's actually like a first to third level adventure originally, and it was written back for like D&D, like I think first edition, maybe second, but I think it was first. And the players are supposed to find this NPC wizard, and he's supposed to find this scroll of Dispel Magic, and when you fight the Naga, she casts Fireball on the party, but he uses the Dispel Magic scroll as a counterspell, because counterspell spell itself didn't even exist back then. So he uses the Dispel Magic scroll as a counterspell and saves the party from the Fireball, and then the party fights the Naga, is how it's supposed to go. The problem is, my players didn't even find the NPC wizard. So it's a good thing that they were level 5 already and actually had counterspell, because that would have been a disaster otherwise. And this was something I thought about a lot, is that there were certain NPCs the players, like as written, the players had to befriend these guys. And I was like, man, like, what if your players don't meet them? What if they don't end up like befriending them? What if they go out murder hobo on them? What if they're just like really rude to the NPCs, and then you can't think of any reason why these guys would want to help the players? Like there were just so many things that could be very, very easily go wrong. And the idea that like, a bunch of like second and third level people are going to fight this Naga who's going to fireball the party, as written, I don't think that was a great design choice. But it's okay. Like I said, my players were level 5 by then, so they actually had counterspell. I did scale the Naga's hit points up more to make the fight still like a really good challenging fight. But I was able to run things basically, and not have to, have Gandalf, the NPC, essentially save the party and then, all that stuff, right? And I generally prefer if my players can make those kind of decisions on their own and not feel like they're getting bailed out, right? Anyways, the next adventure we ran was from a D&D clone game called like Swords and Wizardry, I think it is. And it was actually a bunch of the original TSR guys who, after Wizard of the Coast had bought TSR and got the rights to D&D, they started making their own D&D type supplements for their own game, which was basically just a D&D clone, essentially, right? So I decided to check this out. This was one that the Matt Colville had recommended as well, called Crucible of Freya. I changed it to the Crucible of Shara so I could fit it into my pantheon, Shara being my nature goddess and goddess of the sun and plant life and the harvest and all that kind of stuff, right? And basically it involves like this town which gets attacked by all these orcs who steal a bunch of stuff from the temple, including this magic crucible that they use for their like harvest celebration, and it gives them a bountiful harvest and blesses all the crops and stuff, right? So people, the players knew, kind of put them in touch with this mission, and so the players ended up going, and the orcs are like holed up in like this burnt out, partially destroyed keep. But the keep is still fairly, like, it's all destroyed and ruined, but it's also still kind of serviceable, right? So it involved a lot of like sneaking and that kind of stuff, because a frontal assault was pretty much suicide. But it culminates in this like giant fight in this like shrine, and there's like this human guy, there's like this priest of Orcus, I believe. And the whole temple works as just like a permanent bane spell against the party members. So it ended up making for a really good and tense fight, where all the players are, you're getting a minus D4 on all your attacks and all your saving throws and stuff like that. And so even though, the players are able to win and stuff, it made for like some really, really like tense moments, and it ended up being a really good fight. I did have to scale the NPCs up again because this was like a first and second level adventure originally. But like I said, I liked a lot of the ideas and the theme, the dungeon itself, or the keep essentially, I thought was really well done. So it ended up being a really good adventure as well. Of course, the players survived and recovered the chalice. The last adventure in this particular stage of the campaign was an adventure called Death Frost Doom, taken from a game called Lamentations of the Flame Princess. And I found this one because I was just Googling best D&D adventures, and I found a website where people were like, tons of people had all recommended this one. But the thing that was frustrating to me is that, one, they were all talking about it and what a great adventure it was. They were all talking about the mood and the atmosphere and a lot of like really interesting role play and investigation type stuff. But they all had the same complaint, which is that basically the players would essentially end up unleashing this undead army on the world, which would destroy the entire campaign world, at least as written, right? And the players really have no way of knowing that their actions are going to lead to this result. There's no real clues that any of this is going to happen or anything, right? And just person after person was like, I think it'd be a great one-shot, but unless you want to destroy your campaign world, I wouldn't do it. And other people saying like, I think it might be a great way to like set up maybe like a big fight with the undead, but the way it's written, the undead are just going to take over the world, and you're going to destroy the game world, so don't do it. And it's just person after person after person saying this. And what was frustrating to me, because the first thing I thought of was, well, if you don't like the ending, just change the ending, right? Like, you don't have to destroy your game world if you don't want to. You don't have to unleash this almost infinite army of the undead on your universe. Like, just don't. If you don't want to do that, don't. And like, I kept waiting for somebody to say that, and it's just like page after page after page of this thread, and not one person ever said, if you don't like the ending, change the ending. I could not believe it. It really just blew my mind and kind of caused me to lose some faith in the gaming community, because that was the first thing I thought of. It's like, oh, you don't like the end, change the end. I mean, how hard is that? So that's exactly what I did. The basic idea of this one is the players find out about this. There's like this cabin on the top of this mountain, this seemingly innocent, innocuous cabin. But underneath the cabin, there's like this secret temple to some sort of like chaos god or goddess, right? So the party ends up doing that. They end up going to the top of the mountain and everything else. They investigate. There's some really weird, interesting things there, especially a lot of like time distortion effects. Like, they actually have like stuff that was like trapped in like this liquid time gel and stuff. It was really weird, but also kind of interesting. I remember in like the upstairs part of the cabin, there was a clock, and if a player moved the hands of the clock, then it'd freeze time for everybody except for that player, but it would also like freeze everything else, right? So you couldn't open the doors, for example, because the doors are also frozen in time now. So that player could like walk around the room and stuff, but they couldn't really interact with anything, and they were just forced to wait until the actual time caught up to wherever he moved the hands to, right? And so that ended up happening. I thought that was kind of an interesting and fun mechanic. Just kind of weird, idiosyncratic, I guess. But anyways, the players end up going down into the basement, of course, underneath the where the temple is, and end up fighting all these undead. And I just made it into a series of boss fights, essentially, because there wasn't any combat up to then, and the players were able to like overcome that and stop, the undead leaders of the former cult, right? But there were a few more things that I thought were definitely worth mentioning, because this was like a straight up horror adventure for the most part, right? And there was some really interesting elements, but again, some more stuff that I would change. So, for example, they had this organ that was made of like human bones, and you could find different pieces of music hidden around the temple. And if you played those types of music on the organ, then it would have different effects. And some of them were like curses, some of them were blessings, whatever, right? The problem was that I had, there was no way of knowing which was which. And a lot of these curses were like just permanent curses that were like really terrible in some cases, And I don't really like those types of things unless I'm going to allow like a remove curse to lift them and stuff, right? Because I want to encourage my players to investigate and interact with these types of things. But if they try playing two pieces of music on the organ and they both lead to like horrific permanent effects, players are just going to stop investigating this kind of stuff, and they're just not going to interact with any of it at all. And that's the exact opposite of what I want. So I like to use this kind of stuff to be kind of like funny, or to set a weird atmosphere and keep players on their toes, but also not have it be like some sort of permanent effect that's going to ruin their character, in their opinion, and cause them to, hate the game kind of thing, right? Because that's not what I'm looking for either. So I did think some of the curse effects were like a little ridiculous and a little over the top sometimes, but that's okay. Like I said, I just made them all curable, so no big deal. Anyways, I did make one other adjustment as well. There was like this mural they could find at one point, and it had like all the cult leaders with the grand leader with this crown on his head, and before him kneeling are like all these humanoids like dwarves and elves and humans, but also a bunch of undead and even some demons and stuff in this mural, right? And the mural's like huge. But I decided to put like in the background Bellatrix, the Widow of Lust, who I've mentioned in a couple of the other adventures, because I really wanted this idea that she'd been around for a long time, kind of like corrupting different groups and subverting them, and then just causing them to essentially turn on themselves and collapse. Because that's really what Bellatrix's MO is. Even though she's chaotic evil, she's not really like a big like, I'm just going to go in and destroy stuff. She's more like a seducer who wants to like turn things against their original purpose and corrupt them to the way she wants, and then just watch them destroy themselves. And she kind of plays the long game like that. She's very patient, and I just like this idea that that she'd maybe like done this to all these other civilizations even, and turned them against each other, right? And so I put her in the mural, right? So they see the one guy with the crown, but then standing behind him with a smile on her face is this beautiful woman with long dark hair and huge wings. I know you're thinking something bad there. Get your mind out of the gutter. Huge, like raven black birdwing type things, right? And so that was kind of the first chance for the players to see her in like her actual form, right? Her like actual demon form. So I just kind of like the idea of layering her in a little bit. But anyways, I thought Death Frost Doom was quite excellent. I do recommend it, but just be aware that Lamentations the Flame Princess kind of has an unsavory reputation, and it's not for without cause. I've never played the game myself. I know it's like another one of these D&D type clones, although they kind of changed it at one point to be more like medieval Europe rather than fantasy Europe, and kind of like this dark medieval gritty, more real take on D&D essentially. But it also has like a lot of adventures with just like gratuitous violence and sex and stuff like that. So I've never played the game, but this adventure was quite well recommended, and I can see why, because it was very, very good in a lot of ways. But you know, if you're gonna venture in there, just be warned, right? Let's see. As far as other stuff, we did a few more other random missions. Oh, one I should probably mention just because it was funny to me, even if it wasn't funny to anybody else. I was on my way home from work one day, listening to the radio, which I usually don't do, but on the radio came a song from a band called Billy Talent called Ghost Ship of Cannibal Rats. And in my fairground, in the festival grounds, the players at one point, when they were in fact, very first mission, when they were escorting that couple around through the festival grounds, they end up finding this, like, basically it's like a haunted house, but on a boat, right? So it's kind of like a combination of a pirate boat that's just moored in the festival grounds permanently, pirate ship / haunted house, right? And it just occurred to me, I was like, the players are fighting were-rats, and I have a ghost ship. I should have the players get ambushed on the ghost ship by a bunch of, you know, cannibal were-rats. So sure enough, you end up like working with a bunch of people to try to take down the rest of the were-rats because they'd already fought some earlier. And one of these players, or one of these NPCs, sorry, ends up getting bit and turned into a were-rat, and so they're like forced essentially to lead the party into this ambush, telling them they're trying to help them, of course. And the players get ambushed on the ghost ship by all these were-rats, and it ends up being this huge fight. It ends up leading eventually to the players fighting the were-rat queen beneath the city and finally destroying her. But I just thought it was kind of a funny touch. Just, you know, like I said, I was just driving home one day, heard a strange song, not even like a great song, by the way, but I was just like, I have a ghost ship, and the players have found rats. Maybe I can put these together and have a theme. Anyways, weird story there. So anyways, things kind of started culminating together. By now the players had like leveled up a couple more times because they've, you know, this is already like, what, 6-7 adventures they've done. They did a few more like small mini dungeons. There was one called the Sunken Temple. I think I just got it from some book of like mini adventures of like, you know, 3 to 8 room dungeon type things, right? So there was one with that. They did some tomb inside the city where somebody was trying to like raise some undead, and the players were able to stop that. They did some investigation type stuff in the city as well. So I had some more stuff there. I brought in some more of like the background elements of different player character stuff. So they did some, you know, some more of that type of stuff. Like the Cole mission where, you know, he finds out that his friend is from this other town, or, you know, living through Invasion of the Body Snatchers, a bunch of pod people running around, you know. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff. But eventually they get contacted by the new Crown Justice in charge of taxes. The one warlock that I mentioned, who used to be a member of the Inverted Pyramid and had gone into politics instead. And then when the players essentially exposed the fact that all the Crown Justices were corrupt and evil, and some of them were even working for the enemy empire, some of them were not, you know, but had just been like seduced by Bellatrix, for example, you know. Basically, the city was forced to just clean house on a bunch of the justices, and this woman had gone from one of the minor justices and had been advanced to like one of the 3 crown justices, right? So she'd already met the party, and she brings them in to investigate basically a bunch of disappearances of all these children. So this was kind of an adventure that I took from the Blight itself. I'd mentioned that there was a source book by Frog God Games, which was like, I think 700 to 900 pages long. It was just this giant city source called The Blight. And it's the city of Casterhague, I believe it was called. But one thing that he had in there that I thought was kind of a cool idea, he had this like demon goblin creature that was like dressed like a court jester, but it had a very strong like Pennywise the Clown feel, right? So basically, I was stealing this guy's demon clown that he stole from Pennywise of Stephen King fame, right? But it was a really cool adventure, and obviously I changed a bunch of stuff in it as well. But basically, the players end up trying to investigate this, and in Magnus's background, he'd actually seen the clown thing, or the court jester goblin thing once before, because he was an orphan, and one of his friends from the orphanage, they were talking, and all of a sudden his friend stopped talking, and Magnus turns around and looks, and all there is this ice cream cone laying on the ground, and his friend is gone. But then he thinks he hears this like weird laughing, and when he looks, he sees this like goblin thing carrying what appears to be like a child perhaps, and disappearing through the crowd, and Magnus never sees his friend again, right? So it had some weird creepy stuff like that. Like at one point Magnus sees his old friend again, and he's like, "Why did you leave me, Magnus?" And Magnus is like trying to ignore him, and he's like, "Why did you leave me, Magnus? Why, Magnus? Why, Magnus?" And Magnus is just like, "Stop it, you're not real, just go away." And that was pretty fun too. It was a really good adventure, and it ends up culminating with them fighting the demon goblin creature and destroying it. But when they kill it, it's blood like they're fighting on like this weird like giant rune pattern thing on the floor, but the rune is made of like metal essentially, right? So it's like this giant metal glyph, and it's like recessed into the ground. So like basically it's like the floor itself is just all metal. And when they kill this thing, its blood starts soaking into the glyph, and all of a sudden like the whole like room just like opens up and falls away, and they find themselves on the beach in this other world entirely, right? And they notice that like the sun is like this pale red sun, and they have like no idea where they are. So this kind of set up this whole next segment, where I took some elements from the Blight, where they had this other dimension or realm called the In-Between, which is what I used too. I like that name, the In-Between. But I combined it with a bunch of elements from a different product called A Red and Pleasant Land, which is essentially like Alice in Wonderland meets Dracula. And I really liked a lot of the things about that one, like a lot of the feeling and stuff. My only problem with it was too much Alice in Wonderland, and it was like really heavy on like the weird and whimsical and stuff, and I wanted a much more serious, like somber type of mood here, right? So, as I usually do, I decided to go more in that direction, and then I took like a bunch of elements from both, and then I took a bunch of elements from like the Shadowfell, because I thought I liked the idea of like the In-Between being like almost like a distorted, weird image of the prime material as well, but like not really a mirror image, but just like some weird coincidences and stuff where it's like kind of mirrored in both worlds, but it's not like just, oh hey, here's weird Whitespire, right? I didn't want that. So the players end up wandering down the beach, and after a couple hours of walking, they see a ship approaching, and the ship like throws down anchor, and they lower a rowboat, and some people begin rowing out to them, and all start like waving and saluting, and basically trying to make it showing, like holding up their hands to show they're not carrying weapons or anything like that. And they row up towards the beach and tell the players like, we've been waiting for you. The seer told us that you were coming, and we need your help. And that basically ended like the second tier of play. So at this point, the characters are in like a completely different realm entirely now. They're around level 10-ish, I think, at this point. And now they're just, ready to start extra dimensional stuff or extra planar stuff, right? And that essentially ended up being this tier of play. So this one had less of a like overall idea or concrete storyline, whereas the Siege was very much like, all this stuff is contained within the Siege. This was more about all this stuff is like tied to the player characters themselves and to your backstories and the things you've heard about or interacted with, and then extensions upon those. And maybe the odd, help random strangers missions as well thrown in, right? But anyways, that basically took us to the end of this one. So it was less of like a definitive ending too. Like the Siege, I thought ended really well, that segment, because the players helped lift the Siege, and they got crowned as the champions of Whitespire, and there's the huge celebration, and all the players get like a bunch of money, and then end up buying themselves like houses and estates and whatnot, right? Whereas this one kind of ends up the players being like stranded in some alien world, not really knowing what's going on, while some boat just like, oh hey, we've been waiting for you. And that's kind of where it ends. It just kind of like leaves off in the middle of nowhere. But it was pretty good. It was some of the adventures in here I thought were like quite strong. My overall thoughts, I would definitely say, never be afraid to change around like an adventure. Just because it's something's written down doesn't mean you have to run it that way. It's your game world. It's your game table. Do what you think is, like your players better than whoever wrote the adventure does, right? So, cater things to what to what you want, to what you think the players are going to respond to. And I like to do this kind of stuff a lot with my adventures, where I'll take like somebody's pre-written thing and then I'll just change all the story hooks. I'll change like the climax. I might change a bunch of the elements, but I also like using their ideas because maybe they have a really nice dungeon, or maybe it has a really cool theme, or it has something else going for it. And I'm like, man, this has some really cool ideas. I just need it to fit my story better. So then I just change that and make it fit my story, So, anyways, like I said, I will try to remember to put a link to Matthew Colville's video, because his video on sandboxing is really, really good and really gave me a lot of ideas on how to, really quickly and easily set up a lot of just open world type stuff, right? So anyways, that's this video. Feel free to like, subscribe, comment, of course, hit the bell for notifications, and just let me know what you think of the story so far. I really, really liked this campaign overall. My players all love it too. It's probably one of the best campaigns I've ever run. I would say the King in Yellow, which was my like Lovecraftian horror one, was probably the best. But that was also a very small campaign compared to this one, right? I think the players were like 15th or so level when I started it, because we'd done a bunch of other stuff previously, and then they ended at like level 18 or so, right? So it was much smaller. It was probably 20 game hours total for that entire campaign, I think. 14 of it being like in one day, and we didn't roll initiative for like the first 9 hours, and it was glorious. It was just all role play stuff, and it was just one of the best adventures ever. One of the best I've ever done. But this one, as far as like a big like 1 to 20 campaign, I'd say it was probably my favorite ever. The one I just ran, I definitely think was weaker overall, but ended really, really well. So I will be covering that one when we're done Whitespire, because the two are very intertwined as well, as I've mentioned before. But anyways, like I said, I'm kind of enjoying just like talking about this campaign again. I know a bunch of my players have been like, I've been watching this series and just kind of like, oh man, remember when this happened, or remember when that happened, and, kind of just enjoying that. And I'm really looking forward to like this next part, especially because there's a lot of like really funny stuff that happened in this like next stretch, especially some of the crag moments. It was really the level 11 to like 16 stretch where Crag just really started to shine. He'd been fun up till now, but just the pure idiocy of some of the actions to come and just the hilarity of it just brings my smile to my face just remembering it. But anyways, that's everything I have. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time in the dungeon. Bye.